Hello mate, and welcome to this first video in a new series of getting acquainted with Unity. In this first video we're going to have a little run around the interface and experiment with a couple of things. Before I get started, a huge thank you to everyone for subscribing and hitting that notification icon. That really helps me out. So let's jump into this then. The first time you load Unity, you're going to be expected to create a project and navigate to the folder where you want that project to be, which I'm just going to let you do on your own. And then once Unity loads, this is the screen that you're going to be presented with, and this is with the default interface. You'll notice that there are different panes and tabs around the screen, and we'll just quickly run through those now. The first tab is the hierarchy tab, which is contained on the left hand side as part of a default, and what you can see in there at the moment is a sample scene and a main camera. The scene and the camera are both displayed on the screen, as you can see here iconically, and what we can do is we can create new objects inside this hierarchy and then drag them into wherever we want them in the scene. The hierarchy tab basically shows you everything that's contained in the current scene in your game. In the middle we have the viewport, which is currently set into scene layout mode, which means that you can see where everything is in your scene. This is not to be confused with the game tab, which shows you everything in the game as it currently is in the state, which basically means that you can move objects into the game here, but they don't necessarily exist in the game until you've actually given them some kind of behavior or some kind of property. This shows you what the player will see when they load your game. Down on the right hand side you have the inspector. The inspector is where the properties of whatever you have selected in the rest of the window, it will allow you to see them. So for example, if I select main camera in our scene, it provides us with transforms, which is its position, rotation and scale. The camera properties itself, for example, we can change the background color of the screen, and we can change it from a projection from an orthographic to a perspective if we were to be doing a 3D game. And you can also adjust the size and various other properties. We'll go into those in more detail as they become relevant. And then the last component of the camera is the audio listener, and that is basically what allows us to play sounds in our game. The bottom tab is the projects tab, which shows you the files that are contained within your project folder. So as you can see here, we've got the assets. Normally you'll just have a scenes folder. I've actually created a scripts folder by right clicking into this window, create, and then I've selected create folder and I've called it scripts. And this is the folder in which I'm going to create all of my C# scripts. Just keeps them nicely organized. And this is basically where all of your game assets and packages will be. So this is essentially a file explorer of your project folder. The console tab is where you will see any debug messages which you've programmed into your code, and it's also going to show you any errors or warnings with your code. So for example, references that don't link up to anything, or items that you've got in the game that don't have any purpose. And then that's essentially what that's for. That allows you to debug your code quite nicely. Up here in the top we've got various different tools which allow us to work with the objects within our scene tab. So you've got hand tool, you've got the move tool, you've got the rotate tool, the scale tool, the rectangle tool, the move, rotate or scale selected objects. So that's kind of all of these things in a oneer. And then you've got the editor tool. And those are things again that we will explore in more detail later on. So the first thing that I'd like to do in our scene here is we're just going to create a random object. So I'm just going to go right clicking into my hierarchy tab. You can also achieve the same thing by clicking on the plus symbol with a drop down here, and you've got 2D objects. You can add sprites. I'm going to add a square sprite into here, and as you can see that's now appeared in our scene tab, and the properties have automatically been displayed on the right hand side here, and we can name this whatever we want. So I'm just going to call this square sprite and then hit enter, and now we have that game object in there. And what you'll notice is that we can actually add components. So if we want to give this sprite special behaviors, we can actually code those in C# scripts and then add the C# script as a component of the object, which is something that we're going to explore with a bit later on. The most important things that you can see here at the moment is that you've got a sprite renderer and you've got a transform. Transform allows us to control the sprite's movement around the screen. What you will notice is that the X and Y coordinates are the two relevant ones since we're working in a two-dimensional game. And if you scroll the mouse wheel in your scene tab, you can actually scroll right in on that object. And while we've got it selected, we also have the ability to adjust the scale of the object in the X and Y axis. If I press my middle mouse button in the scene tab, I can drag it around, and then that allows me to see any areas that I haven't currently got. I can actually drag that over the edge there, and then we can move it down so that it's perhaps on the bottom, and that might make an interesting floor for the game. So I can just drag that so that it goes outside the bounds of our scene, and then it's guaranteed to fill the entire bottom. Now if we were to switch to our game tab, you can see that that object has now appeared in there. It doesn't currently have any properties other than a color and a location and a draw mode, but it does have the ability to display on our screen because we're using the sprite renderer, which is great. So let's say I want this object to interact with another object in the scene. What we need to do is we need to add a couple of things to it. Now the first component that we need to add is, I'm going to click on the add component, and I'm going to add rigid body 2D. And what that does is it creates this object's physics. As you can see here, we've got a body type. You can have dynamic, kinematic, or static, and we can change the material if we want to. Now material isn't a material as in texturing, it is a physics material. So if you want a different surface type, perhaps something to have ice or something like that, you can create a specific material, save it as a prefab, and then you can just add it to that, and then all of the properties will automatically be updated. Now something we can do as well is we've got constraints. So let's say we want this object to act as a physical object in the world, but we don't actually want it to be affected by anybody else. So we can freeze its position on X and Y. Because it's a 2D game, there's no reason in freezing it in the Z position because it won't have any depth. What this essentially means is no matter what we do to this object, it's going to stay exactly where it is. So it'll be a really good plane for the floor of our game. So if we were to close that down, of course having rigid body physics is great, but we also need to add a collider component to this object so that other objects can actually detect when they've collided with it. So what we're going to do is we're going to add another component here, and there are different types of colliders, but I'm actually going to add a box collider 2D. And then you can see that that component has also appeared, and we've added that to this object as well. So now this object has a collision detection facet to it. And if I edit the collider button by hitting this button here, you can see that the current collision bounds of this object are all the way around the object like so. Now, let's say, for example, I wanted to make this object like snow. You could actually drag the x-axis down slightly so that the collision doesn't happen until the object that's colliding with it is a few pixels down. And now what we've got there is effectively snow. Now if I go back to my game tab, you can see that nothing has changed at all. All we've got is a rectangular shape that has physics to it and a collision. So now we need to create something that's going to collide with it. So let's go to our scene tab again. I'm going to right click in here, and we're going to add another two-dimensional object, and this time we're going to add a circular sprite. And as you can see, that's appeared in the scene, and if I just move myself out a little bit, I can actually drag that up so it's going to land there. So now if we go to our game, you can see our circle has appeared there. Fantastic. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to give it a slightly different color. Let's give it a slight pink kind of hue to it, so that when these two objects collide, we can actually see how they're interacting. Now obviously this object also needs to have a rigid body 2D component because it's also going to be affected by physics. So we're going to add component, and we're going to go to rigid body 2D, and lo and behold, our rigid body 2D component has now been added to this object, and we're going to save it as a dynamic object because we want this object to move. It's simulated, and currently the gravity scale is 1, which means it's going to fall at what Unity thinks is a reasonable rate for gravity to affect it. But obviously, in order for this object to interact with any other objects in the scene, we also need to add That's right, we need to add a new collider, but a box collider is not going to work for this one. So what we need to do is we need to add a circle collider 2D. And as you can see, the circle has appeared around the edge of that object, which has allowed us to see that the collider is there basically. And we can edit that if we want to, but I'm happy with that the way it is. So what we can do now is if we go back into our game scene, we can see that we have a pink circle and a white floor. And if we were to hit run, our circle's going to fall until it lands on our surface. Now, what you noticed there is that because we were slightly offset and because I do not have the square sprite's rotation locked, it actually rotated slightly there, didn't it? You can see it's very subtle, but it did. So let's come out of play mode again, and we're going to come back to our scene. We're going to select our rectangle. As you can see, rotation is not locked. If this were going to be a real floor plane in a game, we would want to make sure that that was locked as well so that it didn't spin round when our object hit it at, say, a different place. So let's unselect that. Let's drag this over to here. And we're going to increase the mass of this object. We're going to give it 3 times its normal mass. And then we're going to run our script again and we're going to see what happens. As you can see, we've inadvertently created a propeller because our object's rotating around its central axis. Our ball has fallen to its death and this will eventually slow down, but for now let's just turn that off. So what we need to do is we need to make sure that we freeze rotation on this object like so, and then we can drag this to wherever we want in our scene and this will no longer rotate, so we can just hit play there, and as you can see this is permanently locked in place. Now, this is a nifty little trick that we've done here. Because our collision is slightly lower down in the floor plane, it's given it almost the illusion of being a 3-dimensional surface because we can still see the ball being there. Basically, it's landed in the middle of the plane and not at the very top of it. So it's given us an illusion of that floor having some depth to it, which is a trick that's quite often used in some 2D games. So it's something that's worth remembering, that's for sure. If we just turn off our play button there, then that just means that our computer's no longer trying to process that information, albeit a very limited amount of information at this time. It's a good idea to remember to turn off the play demo mode when you're working on the objects in the scene tab so that you can have as much processor power dedicated to what you're doing as possible. Now we can minimize these by clicking on the arrows to the side of them. We don't really need to adjust these at this precise moment in time. Suffice to say that it's just good to know that they're there. And the same thing can be said for our square component. There we go, they're minimized too. And then our main camera, we've got all the properties available there. And you'll notice that when we click on the main camera, we get a little preview of what the game screen is going to show when we switch over to that just there. So I think that covers it for the absolute basics of getting started with Unity. We are going to continue building once we get back in the next video, but until then, you take damn good care of yourselves, alright? Bye bye.